Good evening, folks. Um, I'm here with Dadman Walking.
Hello, everybody. Is everyone today, night, evening, morning, wherever you are?
At the moment, unfortunately, the Lady Arwen has actually been delayed in Avalon. Something obviously has taken up her attention. And we're getting slightly worried because Firefly still hasn't reported back from his last mission. However, he has left us something he's been working on. Which he has asked us that you all see, just to give you a taste of what the new year may bring. There you go. That's going to be our new opening when it's
Looks
completely
good.
finished.
Looks really good.
I've got to actually remember here that you folks in the chat are about 30 seconds behind me, which is me, going off a bit. But I have a question to ask everybody. Whatever your question, what's the first thing that comes to mind if I say to you, King Arthur? Dadman, if you can waffle through or give the chat chance to catch up.
Yes, exactly. Oh, there's so much, especially if I stop to think.
Yeah,
there's so many different things. But if I do a first quick gut reaction, it has to be Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
I'm not in the least bit surprised in that. There's a reason that's on the thumbnail. Be interesting to see. Okay, so someone has to say Robin Hood. Someone has to be different. Thank you very much for that one. I would imagine for most people, the things that are actually on the three of the things on the thumbnail there probably come to mind. Excuse me. You've got the Sword in the Stone, you've got the Holy Grail, and you've got, as Dadman said, certain comedy film.
Yes.
And when you get a comedy film that can make a comment on the lines of, what was the quote? I don't think suspicious ladies lying underwater passing out swords is a good way to define government. Yeah.
Hey.
But it may interest you to know. I tend to think, being like a lot of people, I think here, science fiction fan as well. I tend to think of, in some ways, of King Arthur's, or the legend specifically, the myth and legends of King Arthur, as a black hole. An equally good one might be if you imagine you're standing on top of a very long mountain, a very high mountain with a long, reasonably gentle slope that's all covered in snow, and you get a little bit of a pebble or a stone, and you start it rolling downhill, and it gradually picks up.
The snowball effect, it starts out small and grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and it really ends up taking a life of its own.
Yeah,
it's not what it originally started. It's gotten so much larger and bigger than where it started.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, unfortunately, I have to say that most of what first comes to mind when you think about King Arthur is probably wrong is not the right word. But I'm going to say wrong. We can trace I mean, there were probably, as with most myths and legends, there were probably elements of the King Arthur story that goes back thousands of years. Elements of heroism, story ideas. But the Arthur myth is one that has grown probably more than anything else, I think, through the ages.
Yes. Is there, Colin? Is there any particular starting point with the Arthur legends? Is it any one specific person or event that it can be traced to, or is it a combination of?
Thank you so much for that, lady. You'd almost think we rehearsed this, which we didn't. Yes, interestingly. We had a meeting about this beforehand. There are a number of sources, there are a number of contributors, if you like. But given that most of us think of the knights in shining, like the shinies, so as reenactors tend to call them, not the knights with big shining plate mail armor and the rest of it, which is basically late 15th century, so 1400s. The origins are probably about almost 1,000 years earlier, 800 years earlier. The origins of King Arthur, and there's a reason why at the very start of the introduction I put from a Romano Britain, are after Rome leaves. You have to remember that 410 AD, Rome is coming under the Roman Empire. He's almost like, if you imagine the Mediterranean as a mouth, the Roman Empire is almost like a set of big lips. Literally, I mean, literally, it is Southern Europe. It actually goes quite far out. It's a really bad lipstick.
Okay, yeah.
It's the joke of lipstick on the left-hand side, because it goes quite a bit over almost into Asia, but down into North Africa and the rest. But basically, it's been attacked. They've never gone into Northern Europe. And in fact, the phrase Germania, from which we get in the modern country of Germany, basically means anywhere the Romans hadn't actually managed to get. Hey, PJ and Jim, glad you can make it, guys. Welcome. I see my pandering on your channel yesterday helped. So yes, so the Roman Empire, they never get. Germania is basically where Rome didn't get. Rome's got as far north as Hadrian's Wall. It in fact gets about 30 miles further north to the Antonine Wall, but never sticks, and it never gets into Scotland, it never gets into Ireland, and it never actually gets all the way into Wales. But 410 AD, Rome is starting to come under attack from barbarians, which is an entirely different series of lectures. And it starts retreating, and they draw back they pull back the legions. And just to put this in context, especially for my friend, for Dadman and my other friends that side of the Atlantic of the pond, Britain has been a province, not a colony, a province of the Roman Empire for 370 odd years at that time. So you think that sort of back to what? 16. I can't do the maths, but it's for about nearly 400 years. Well, of course, it was the Scots that supplied the bricks. Why on earth would the Romans not get the Scots to build the wall to keep them out? The Americans were going to try that a few years ago with the Mexicans. Superb idea.
Yeah, the Romans weren't going to do it themselves. They were busy fighting, eating, and everything else. You let the local population do all the hard work.
Yeah, they supply the bricks. But basically, that's literally just scene setting. But literally, so you've got a situation of 400 years. We've been part of the Roman Empire. We've been a Christian for about the last century or so. And all this goes, and half the power structure just goes almost literally overnight.
Yeah, I think your point is basically when they withdraw back to deal with their other issues, it creates a power vacuum in England, which leads to probably anarchy or maybe strong leaders or personality rising up to exhibit control of the area, right?
Yeah, literally. I mean, you get warlords coming. But the thing is, we don't know. As like most medievalist and historians, I don't like the phrase Dark Ages because it implies our ancestors weren't inventive. They were. It's just that literacy disappeared and we have very few records. But the earliest, he says, checking his notes, the earliest mention we have of an Arthur type figure is in the 6th century, so it's the late 500s poem, and from the north of Britain. It's called, and my pronunciation this is probably going to be atrocious because I'm going to be trying to do it in Welsh. Y Gododdin. It's early Celtic. It's a passage about a great warrior named Gwador or something. And I'll quote this bit. He was worthy in the front of the most generous army. He gave out gifts from the herd of steeds in the winter. He fed black ravens on the wall of a fortress. Though he was not Arthur, among the powerful in battle in the van and all the shield wall, Gwathur.
And that's from the 6th century, 500s.
Yeah, that's from the 500s.
And see, that's what's at least from over here. You know, so much of the stuff programs from Hollywood and other source materials that you do see, we always think back to the 1500s, 1600s with the knights in the shining armor, and that's where we that's our starting base of an Arthur type legend, not understanding that, you know, a legend can start much earlier in history, and then, you know, like you said earlier, the snowball effect.
Well, there's I mean, there is a reason for that. Well, very good, very, very good specific reasons for that. But interestingly, there, what you might notice is a few things. If you actually think about it, it suggests a couple of things. It suggests that this guy, this Gwathur, was a mighty knight. You know, it's basically saying he's a real good guy, right? But he was nothing compared to Arthur. Which is fine, but then it also implies, of course, that Arthur, for everybody hearing this poem, would know who Arthur was. So even by the time this poem is written out, Arthur is quite well known. Arthur is well known. Even though we, from nearly 2,000 years in the future, don't have much information about the period, what information we have suggests Arthur was quite well known. In fact, there's some of the things that exist are things like there's some name lists, royal lists, and this sort of thing, and 4 different royal families about the same time. I'm going to say, you've got to remember we're talking smaller kingdoms here, rather than England, Britain, etc. All have their firstborn sons are called Arthur or an equivalent thereof, all approximately the same sort of time. And typical, it's great, just somebody to go in the Kindle decides to close down. That's not a problem. But we've got, so you've got these things coming. We also get, later on, 6th century, we get a monk called Gildas. And what we have to remember also is that literacy for the next several hundred years. In fact, quite almost the next millennium is almost entirely in the hands of the clerics. So almost all there's a reason why when I do medieval reenacting, most of the songs I know are A, in Latin, and B, they're religious songs because they come from the religious houses, monasteries. The next one of the most important things also of this is a monk called Gildas, and he writes his De Excidio et Conquisto Britanniae, or the history and conquest of Britain. There's a lot of bits and pieces in this, but he's the first person that mentions the siege of Mount Badon, which we don't know where Mount Badon is. For anybody this side of the pond will know there are no mountains in England. There aren't many mountains on the island of Great Britain. Snowdon, Ben Nevis are probably the tallest two. But we're not the Himalayas here. So Mount Badon is probably refers to a hill, a large hill, a hill fort, perhaps.
Well, hey, at least y'all have more mountains than we have where I am. So,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things you talked about, the lack of the writings and the disposition of the writings and being spread out, it was pulled back into the monasteries. I mean, Disney had an exhibit at Epcot that actually described that with those during the Dark Ages was, you know, a lot of the writings were destroyed and, you know, with the invasions and stuff. But a lot of what did remain was because of the monasteries and the areas that were fortified to keep those writings alive and to keep a record.
Well, as a side note, it's amazing. There was, I think it's the Book of Kells, which is one of the surviving ones, was literally buried in a swamp to keep it because the Vikings were the ones that came and invaded this. Yes, I'm looking in your direction, Jim the Viking. But no, I'm not really. But the Vikings invaded. The Vikings were pagans. They invaded, and they could a lot probably weren't even literate. They had a pre-literate massive saga to do. But so the books were nothing. They'd rip them apart. They'd possibly use the pages for various things, and they take out the jewels. So a lot of times the monsters get attacked. Sometimes literally stuff gets buried and actually gets preserved. So that's where a lot of this comes from.
Yeah.
But we've got Nennius, who's actually writing his History Brittonum, History of the Britons. He's writing this about the year 800. So that's 200 plus afterwards. He asserts quite authoritatively that the Battle of Badon was won by the Britons under the leadership of Arthur. Now, what we have to remember when we talk in Britons, we're not talking Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons are the bad guys at this point. These are the Britons, the Celts, the ancient Britons, the ones such as the Iceni, Queen Boudica, Boadicea, the Iceni, etc. All the people we think of in Roman history, they're gradually being pushed. There's various things have happened, and I say the Romans are left. People are coming in, pushing in, invading, piloting, coming in, all sorts. But the interesting thing, the first concrete thing is that although we don't have much in the way of literary evidence, we do have archaeological evidence. And the evidence seems to suggest that somewhere around the 5th century, around the year 500, into the 6th century, the invasions quite literally stopped. There's a line you can almost draw down the middle of England. And again, most of this relates to England. Scotland doesn't come into this much at all, I'm sorry to say. There's a lot of this actually comes from Wales as well. but it's mainly an English, what we now think of an England situation. But there's an invasion stops, and it even seems to be pushed back for about 50 years. So for half a century, 2 generations, you've got a situation where the gradual incursion, be it invasion, well, direct actual hack and slash and pillage and burn, etc., invasion, or coming over, settling, trading, and what we call these days would be brain switched off. Joining, coming together as inclusiveness, including within, joining within, whatever you call it. You get this influx that stops about 50 years. It's held and even pushed back, and then it starts all over again.
Colin, can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Real quick. When you say the archaeological evidence, what do you mean? Is it that you can tell stuff under the ground that like the invasion stopped in physical locations, or how?
Yeah, it's things like grave goods, possibly architectural styles, different designs of buildings. You can see you've got stuff that's Britain origin, and then you've got more Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon and the Frisians, which is basically Holland all the way up to North Germany, almost up to Denmark. As the Anglo-Saxons, we call them in general. But you've got various bits and pieces that come in, and we can infer that it stops.
Okay.
There's about a 50-year difference. So something happened. There's references in various mythologies to 12 battles, the last of which is at Mount Baden. Or at some point later on, that's going to become that's possibly going to become Camlan. We keep going. It comes in and goes. Next major source really is William of Malmesbury in 1125, so early 12th century. So we're talking about 50 years after the Norman invasion. You got the deeds of the English kings, and one of his lines is, "This is that Arthur who is raved about even today in the trifles of the Bretons or Britons, a man who is surely worthy of being described in true histories rather than dreamed about in fallacious myths. For he truly sustained his sinking homeland for a long time and aroused the drooping spirits of his fellow citizens to battle. Finally, at the siege of Mount Baden, relying on the image of the Lord's mother, which he had sewn on his armour, looming up alone, he dashed down 900 in the enemy of an incredible massacre."
Wow.
There's another line that sort of comes in around this time as well. "However, the tomb of Arthur is nowhere to be found. That man whose second coming has been hymned in the dirges of old."
So this is a case where he's got this big legend of that he led this battle, had all this success in it, but yet there's no grave. There's no indication that he was actually buried somewhere. Is that right?
Yeah. Sorry, you cut out for a second there, but yeah, basically, yeah, he comes in and this is a thing that goes through, comes in and out. We don't know where he's been buried. We'll come back to that later, I promise.
Oh yeah.
And in fact, you get again Gerald of Wales. You get quite a bit of this class that comes in from Wales. You've got a monk called Gerald of Wales writes De Instructione Principium on the instruction of princes. And he expands on this, but he introduces another bit. Gradually, gradually we've got bits and pieces are coming in from here, bits are coming in, bits are being added. Gerald of Wales tells us, then too, Morgan, the noble matron and lady ruler of those parts,
Mhm.
who was closely related by blood to King Arthur, transported Arthur after the Battle of Camlan to this island that is now known as Glaston to heal his wounds.
Okay.
Um,
So it sounds like that snowball's getting bigger. We started with something in about the 500s, and now the legend's growing over time,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, it's coming in. The next, about the same time, we get that probably the first big collection of stories. You get Geoffrey of Monmouth. Monmouth is in Wales. We're talking Welsh again. He does the history of the kings of Britain, similarly named to William of Malmesbury's one. He brings in another character. He brings in Uther Pendragon, who is Arthur's father. And he's also Morgan's father in some traditions. It gets wholly confusing. The Geoffrey of Monmouth also brings in another aspect which hasn't turned up at all until now. He reworks a 6th century, so going back to the 500s, Welsh bard named of Merlin. And he reworks his bard. He was a pattern, was a real character that Merlin is, there were records of him. Drags him out, he places him in King Arthur's court. It gets, because Latin is still the major language of writing, it gets Latinized to Merlinus, who will surprise absolutely no one.
Yeah.
Becomes Merlin. So that's when we now get Merlin comes in. Geoffrey's also, there are some things in Geoffrey that comes in here which don't always make it into modern consciousness, into a lot of the modern Arthurian stories. It's some bits are slimmed down. I mean, according to Geoffrey, sometime Arthur's assumed the throne. He's brought any number of lands under his rule, including Norway, Denmark, and Gaul. A delegation arrives from the Roman Emperor. Now, so remember, we're sending this back. So he's writing in the 12th century, but he's writing about events in the 5th. So Rome is still there, in theory. So you get a delegation from Rome demanding that Arthur acknowledges his sub-king and render tribute to Rome. Arthur doesn't take this well. Not only does he not send tribute, he goes all the way to Rome to pay tribute to him and conquers Rome. Now, obviously, we know this didn't happen in history, but this is myth starting to build up. Another thing that Monmouth brings in, or Geoffrey Monmouth brings in, is filling out more about the death and so about Mordred and the death of Arthur. Mordred is Mordred is one of these figures who sometimes he's a nephew, sometimes he's a known relative of Arthur. But while Arthur's busy on in Europe doing his European tour, he gets word that his nephew and Queen Guinevere have, quote, joined in an unconscionable lust.
Oh boy.
So in this one, it's Mordred. We've got no Lancelot yet. It's Mordred and Guinevere who are having an affair. Arthur returns home, and as most legends say, meets with Mordred for thousands on both sides at Camlan. Mordred's killed and Arthur is supposedly fatally wounded. Because Geoffrey also adds something slightly more to this. Arthur, our renowned king, was mortally wounded and was carried off to the Isle of Avalon so that his wounds might be attended to. He handed the crown of Britain to his cousin Constantine, son of Cador, Duke of Cornwall. This in the year 542 after our Lord's incarnation. So we've now got a specific date, theoretically, So again, mid 6th century now. So starting, and we've now got firming up of this idea that Arthur's mortally wounded in battle, but he doesn't die. Again, third repetition, we don't see him die. I can't remember exactly where it is, but we all know that a lot of stories in this sort of myths and legends come out they're allegorical, or they are meant to teach a lesson of sorts.
Yeah, and what is interesting is hearing that it seems like each person that refers to the historical Arthur character is also adding to the lore.
Yeah.
That like you mentioned earlier, again with the snowball effect, that one person mentions some parts, then somebody else comes again later. They fill in the blanks more or add other pieces to it, because that's interesting. You talk about was it Mordred? Because we all think of, from my perspective at least, it's Lancelot and Guinevere with the affair. So this is another. It's interesting, and I guess that happens a lot in legends, doesn't it? Where depending on the writer, the facts can vary from writer to writer.
Oh yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm skipping over this because there's full disclosure, as they say. A lot of this I got from, and I can heartily recommend. We were honestly not being sponsored, but if we were, a lot of this comes from a series of lectures from the Great Courses Plus, who changed their name, unfortunately. The particular series of lectures about the history of King Arthur is 24 half-hour lectures. That's 12 hours. I'm paraphrasing quite a bit here.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's other things. It's not. I'm not just doing these things, but this was a really useful resource from other things as well. But we've got, like, for example, I can't remember exactly when it comes in, but we all know we've all heard of Excalibur, right? No, Excalibur was not the sword in the stone. The sword in the stone was a different sword. Excalibur was the sword given to Arthur by the Lady in the Lake. That reminds me, there's one I didn't put in the notes because she didn't. However, which comes back. I mean, interestingly, comes back even later. But Excalibur can't be defeated. Bears Excalibur can't be defeated in battle. But Excalibur, like most swords, comes with a scabbard. And the scabbard is also magic. The scabbard has a healing power. And basically, whoever is carrying the scabbard, can never die from a mortal wound, can never die in battle. Arthur, in his youth, is given a choice and basically chooses Excalibur. So he chooses victory over not being able to be killed. As I said, that's probably an example of a story element brought in to introduce culture, to introduce the idea of think carefully what choices you make. That in youth we can make rational choices, but we still get this coming in. So we've got it's about the same sort of time as Monmouth. It's a bit later than Monmouth, 1189. So we're actually now up in approximately the period of Richard the Lionheart and King John. A couple of interesting things happen. We're carrying on for the moment with the story, and I get to do a little more bit of poetry reading. there's an Englishman called Layamon, and he actually writes in English or in the vernacular, so local, what was English at the time, or partial English, rather than Latin. But he has a slightly different story in how, and his description of Arthur's non-death. I mean, part of the story is quite interesting. Is if you get the full legend, you've got the battle. Arthur's been mortally wounded. He knows he has to return, something that doesn't very often make it into the movies now. He has to return Excalibur to the Lady in the Lake. He can't go and be healed without it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In fact, if anybody has been watching Fat Stevens reviews of Babylon 5, they may actually recognize this next bit, because yes, the King Arthur legend made it into the 22nd century in Babylon 5.
Oh, wow.
Arthur knows he can't be taken to be healed or to die or whatever until he's returned Excalibur to the Lady in the Lake. As it happens, now I'm not sure if the Battle of Baden or Camlan or whichever battle this is happens to be near the same lake he got Excalibur from, or if the Lady of the Lake can sort of appear in any body of water. But basically, he tells the Bedivere to go and throw Excalibur back into the lake. Doesn't explain why. He just goes, look. So Bedivere walks off towards this lake, and he thinks to himself, all the good that Excalibur could do. So he puts Excalibur down behind a rock. He walks back to Arthur, and he tells him, and Arthur says what happened, and he spins some story, and Arthur says, basically calls him out on it. He says, no, go and do it again.
Right.
Bedivere goes back to the lake, same thing happens. Interestingly, like the number 12, the number 3 occurs quite often in mythology. You may recall, for example, that St. Peter denies Christ 3 times.
Right.
There's something 3 has got some sort of mystical, or there's something in mythology about the number 3. But and eventually the third time he goes out, he throws it out, and he comes back and he says something along the lines of, this hand came out of the lake and caught the sword and sank back under. And Arthur accepts this. And then, as Layman puts it, a little boat came tilting over lifting over the waters, gliding there from the sea.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 men in it of a wonderful appearance. They raised Arthur up and rapidly took him away. They laid him softly down, and outwardly they sailed. So once again there occurred what Merlin had uttered. Countless cares will be felt when Arthur was faring forth. The Britons still hold that he is alive and in health, that he lingers in Avalon with the loveliest of the Fays. Fay here meaning Fay as in fairy folk.
Mm-hmm.
And they are always awaiting the time when Arthur returns. There never was a man born of a blessed lady who can tell you any more of Arthur's true fate. But once there was a Magus whose name was Merlin, and he pronounced these words, and his prophecies were true, and Arthur will return, who will redeem the King of the Britons. In fact, he is Rex Quondam, Rexque Futurus. And of course, I trust everybody sufficiently familiar with Latin to be able to translate that. No? Oh, I'm disappointed. As Disney put it, the once and future king.
The once and future king. Yeah. So according to the mythology, then Arthur had to go with the boat to be healed, but he could never return. Right? Is that or they waited for him to return, but he never was able to return. Right?
Yeah, yeah. The theory, well, the theory is that he's returned. He's mortally wounded, but he's taken to Avalon, where they actually heal even a mortal wound.
Right.
And that's the last we hear of him. He is supposedly there still.
Well, not I'm trying, and I don't mean to sidetrack really here, but
No, that's fine.
it almost sounds a little bit like with the Lord of the Rings with Frodo. When after he got stabbed by the dagger, he was never the same, and then at the end he was taken over to the Elven lands, and but he could never come back. He had to stay there. It almost seems like there might be some parallel with it, coincidental on purpose. I don't know.
Well, Tolkien was at one point going to one of Tolkien's unfinished works is Arthurian in nature. So yeah, there was definitely an influence there. But it's not so much that he can't return. I think it's the thing is he was so severely wounded, so that he's being healed, and it's going to take a long time to heal him.
Yeah.
That's effectively where the legend ends. Obviously, well, that's where the story of King Arthur stops, and he disappears, and he will come back at some point. But obviously, we've got the mythology itself expands massively.
Well, to the point, I think with what I was saying, and like I said, if it's coincidental, and you mentioned that Tolkien may have some Arthurian stuff, but it shows you the power of a legend of something like Arthur, and the whole hand-me-downs, the way it can influence other writings in the future, not just the legend itself, but other works of fiction, other stories can use the themes that have been introduced in the Arthur legends and use them for their own story devices.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is where it starts getting interesting, if you like.
Absolutely,
because the legend. I mean, you think about this. You got one thing: we've never seen him die. No one sees him die. So he's not dead. You've got what you then come along. You then come probably the next biggest influence. I hate to admit it, but we've got to go over to France now.
Oh boy!
Yeah, we've got to go to the French for a while now. Chrétien de Troyes.
Yeah.
He comes in with a couple of things. He actually brings in. Well, actually, he brings in three things: two story elements and a concept. He brings in Lancelot, and he brings in the adultery with Guinevere. So Lancelot and the Guinevere is his. He also brings in the first mention of a little thing called a Holy Grail. That comes in from the French the French tradition as well. What you've got to remember is this story rambles all over the place, and there are so many influences on it. Henry II has of England the first first Plantagenet king, etc. He is the second husband of a lady called Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine is an extremely interesting character. And if you want to talk about powerful women, you could go no better than her. But very basic. Aquitaine is in southern France. Aquitaine, southern France, is linked to Spain, which is still somewhat Moorish in question. Good evening, Cam. Don't worry. Glad you can make it here, mate. And I'm sure you can catch up later on. You can watch the first half of this or so later on, I'm sure. I hope you enjoyed the rest of it. So where was I? Yes, Eleanor of Aquitaine. You've got a tradition comes out of Spain and of the troubadour tradition. The the minstrels, etc. The minstrels exist,
Right.
but there's a particular type of tradition comes out of them there. One of the things that comes in here is what becomes known as courtly love. As Geoffrey Monmouth puts it, ladies at King Arthur's court deigned to love no man till he was 3 times proven in military combat. Thus, the women were made more chaste. I'm not quite sure if that's CHASTE or CHASED, but we'll leave that to imagination.
There's a big difference. There's a big difference between the two. Chaste, yes.
Yeah, chaste but never caught. And
I don't think the men would calm down. So yeah.
This is a really intriguing concept because it's kind of rather pointless, but it means I don't think it's a shame that the Lady Armin isn't here because running down through the chat, unfortunately, I think we seem to be an all stag evening. It would be interesting to see a female point of view on this, but the idea that okay, you can express undying love for the Queen, but you're never going to touch her, so you're okay to carry on with your wife. You know, this interesting concept of okay, unrequited love, and it's pure love, and it's and I think it's an odd concept, but it gives us chivalry. A lot of the ideas we have of chivalry, some of which are some of which are a little bit more specific than others. But you get this comes in. Chrétien gives us an extremely full and a hyperbolic depiction of this idea. The idea, as I say, of getting sworn love for the Queen, but nothing's ever going to come of it unless your name's Lancelot, and all hell's going to break loose when you finally do.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe is it also like to the hero's journey? Also, in a part tragedy, because there's that romantic love story, but it can't be, so you have to live, basically suffering. That you can't act on what you feel.
Yeah. There's some interesting alternatives that in some of the expanding Arthuriana as well. But you've got one of the really interesting things I thought is little bits and pieces here. One of the first stories that Lancelot comes in is again I think is probably outside of those who've got specific interest in Arthur, in the Arthurian legends. Certainly I wasn't aware until I heard about it in one of these lectures. The Knight of the Cart, one of the first Lancelot tales, and basically it's a long story, but basically Queen Guinevere gets kidnapped again by a guy called Malagort, and Lancelot sets off to rescue her. At one point, he's lost his horse, he's lost his way, and he's offered a chance to ride in the back of a cart. Now, what you have to remember is that riding in the back of a cart was what criminals did.
Right.
That's how criminals were taken to their execution. So Lancelot hesitates and then decides, my honour is not as important as rescuing the Queen, jumps on board, goes off, and eventually rescues the Queen.
Right.
When she hears about this, she lets off on him for daring to hesitate for 2 seconds. Some interesting little insights in how this honour and this whole thing works. It's like a lot of these myths and legends, as I say. The snowball is huge because quite a lot of the stuff that gathers itself is quite large. You also get quite a bit of of literature comes in, there's a whole tradition in Northern Europe, in the whole Germanic tradition. There's a whole Scandinavian tradition which is linked to, but quite different from. Probably the most famous, most influential of all of these that comes in is Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. This is written between 1468 and 1470, which, for anybody who's familiar with English history, may well recognise is in period that we call the Wars of the Roses, starting around the Wars of the Roses, but coming up towards the end of the medieval period, the Wars of the Roses. Malory is actually in prison for rape, amongst other things. He's writing this, and a lot of what he's writing is, again, similar, going back to Gerald Wales, specifically on the instruction of princes. Malory's writing a lot of things he's bringing in, of what he thinks how people should behave. He's trying to write this. He's the only medieval era text which basically tries to tell the whole story from start to finish. It's massive. As you can imagine, he drags in influences from all over the place. As I say, you've got, I mean, if anyone's familiar with, for example, Tristan and Isolde, which we will come back to shortly, it's a Germanic, quite a wide, long story, but it comes in a lot of these chivalric myths are brought in and updated, and they're tacked onto the Arthurian legend because they happen to visit the Arthurian court at some point, or oddly enough, by pure coincidence, Arthur happens to be the uncle of Tristan, I think, in this case, and so on. These things, they just come in from everywhere. It literally, the Arthurian legend's literally never seen a story it doesn't like and grab onto itself.
Yeah.
Another thing that interesting changes is we've already mentioned the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is probably worth a story on its own, a stream lectures on its own. It's all sorts of things. It's Chrétien de Troyes is a fancy serving dish. There's a German called Wolfram von Eschenbach. It's a magical stone that heals in his version of it.
Oh wow!
For a chap named Robert de Boron, it's the cap. It's what we know. We think of most the cup that Christ drank from the Last Supper.
Right.
It's a cartoon sketch for a certain comedy troupe.
Yeah. So basically, the Holy Grail, once it's been introduced, it's actually in different forms, depending on the culture or who's writing the.
Yeah, literally.
The story,
to the point that Dan Brown comes along and does some very clever linguistic gymnastics and changes it into the bloodline of the last from the Merovingian kings.
Wow, it's interesting you say that. You talk about the stone because I'd say like one of the Indiana Jones movies, The Last Crusade, used that the Holy Grail as the theme of the whole thing.
Yep.
And they took the Joseph of Arimathea, that it was a cup that Christ drank from angle. It was interesting, and that's, I think, the perspective that most of us in modern times take that. It's interesting to hear what you said about in other writings. It's something different, and that's something I didn't know.
I mean, in some of them, it's not even particularly holy. It's spiritual, perhaps, but it's not particularly magical or especially holy. It goes. I mean, it expands out, as I said, and it's all sorts of like the Arthur legend. And I've got a note here that says, and that's where we leave it. Or maybe not. That's not quite the end of the story. I don't think it ever does end. In the Victorian era, you get Alfred Lord Tennyson writes The Idylls of the King, which is a collection of poems on Arthur. And in fact, it becomes so popular, it ushers in a whole new age of writing and scholarship. And you've got Richard Wagner, writes a number of operas, Parsifal, which is Percival, which is another Grail-linked story,
Right.
And he writes Tristan and Isolde, again another big operatic telling. One thing I did, you talk about Joseph of Arimathea reminds me. There is a tradition that Joseph of Arimathea actually may, if we go down the Grail is the blood that Christ drank from at the Last Supper and collected his blood from the cross. That's the second time both of them have been here, because there is a tradition that in the 30 odd years about Christ, about Jesus, he travels to Britain as a young child, as a child of indeterminate age, with Joseph of Arimathea. They visit Glastonbury Tor, which is a hill on top of a mountain, and in fact, that is why my coat of arms that you see there is what it is. The green represents a field and a hill, and the tower in the middle is the Tor on top of it. It's a tower on top of it. But there was in the Middle Ages there was a monastery there. The Joseph of Arimathea thing suggests or tells that he plants a walking stick in the ground and leaves it, and it grows and it becomes a tree, and there are still cuttings of that tree alive today.
Wow.
If I do a quick share screen, I need to do something. Do this the right way. There's another connection to Glastonbury. Glastonbury has, as I said, Glastonbury is quite possibly the inspiration for Avalon, because although it's not an island now, up until the Middle Ages, it was an island, and it was more than that. It was also in marshes, and it was also in reeds, so it was cut off a lot of the time.
Okay.
Come back to that in a little bit if we have time. The other thing is that there was an abbey, and okay, so we're going to share the screen now. In 1191, let's see if this should actually come up. Yes, good. This happens. I'm hoping that's on screen. Yes, it is. Yeah. Yep. In 1191, the bodies of King Arthur and his queen were said to have been found on the south side of the Lady Chapel. As it says there, their remains were removed, and it's all been lost now. But they're also found was the reason they reasonably certain it was Arthur's grave is because a cross was found on it, and this is a drawing. Let's see if we can get this. See if I can actually. It's not that easy to get this up, unfortunately. The whole thing, because of the limitations of the screen. But this is a drawing. There was a drawing was made of the front side. It was a two-sided Celtic style cross. And what it actually says, it's not very easy to read because Latin is hic jacet septus incultus rex Arturus in Isla Avalonia. Here lies the body of King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. The other side of that, the reverse side, is supposed to have said, although there are no images that's remaining at all, it's supposed to have said, with his second wife Guinevere. So really, unfortunately, slight problem in that the monastery was having somewhat financial troubles for the last few years, and they'd had a fire, and this find really did help them out with pilgrimages. So exactly what happened is a debatable point, but certainly it brought it back into the public consciousness. Edward III, my king, when in my Archer Collin capacity, the character, my reenactment character exists in the period of Edward III. He is very Arthurian linked, very much into the ideas of chivalry. He actually creates the Order of the Garter, which is still one of the oldest and is still the premier order of chivalry in the United Kingdom, and thus possibly the premier order of chivalry in the world. I don't know. I genuinely don't know that. Based on Arthurian myth and legend. So it has a massive effect. Then the legend just goes on and goes on and goes on. I mentioned Babylon 5. That's not Arthur's first science fiction connection.
Oh, really? What are the what are the connections?
I'm being slightly generous with my descriptions here, but a countryman of yours introduced King Arthur to time travel.
Okay.
Yeah. A gentleman named Mark Twain.
Yep.
Yeah, he brings us a Connecticut Yankee in Arthur's Court, which is my God, if you think about it, if you actually publish it today, we'd be screaming from the roofs that it was so SJW and woke. It's unbelievable.
Oh yeah, everything is supposedly
No,
these days. But I tell you what, what a concept with that. I mean, I've actually, that particular work that you mentioned, I've actually thought, what would it be like if you actually could time travel back? If you would be the person that was in the book, living in that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it actually has some really interesting time travel concepts because he goes back and he tries to, and Hank, the lead character, gets in trouble for, or gets part of the trouble he gets is because he tries to bring in so much of 19th century American values to 5th century, but it seems like it's about the right period, 6th century England. Another one that comes in sometime around then goes way back to a line almost in which one was it? It was the 12th. I think it was the Mort d'Arthur. I think it was Mort d'Arthur. He ends up with because what he does, no, it's not. Sorry, no, I'm wrong. It's the once and future king.
Okay.
T.H. White. Sword in the Stone. You may recognise that title as well.
Mm-hmm.
Which tells the story of Arthur's upbringing and education at the hands of Merlin.
Right.
Which there's none of that. I mean, in the general legend, like Christ, there's quite a few parallels between Arthur and Christ. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
the myth, the general legends of Arthur don't tell us anything about his upbringing. We don't see him till he's a grown adult and he's helping his brother out, and he pulls the sword from the stone. It's basically the first time he turns up.
Mm-hmm.
So White is making this up entirely, but he brings us young Arthur, nicknamed Wart, who accomplishes his pedagogical program primarily by turning. Good God, whoever I copied this one really likes their alliteration, don't they? By turning Wart into different animals. White apparently is also the one that brings in the idea that Merlin ages backwards. So he's already lived Arthur's future, which is why he can tell him what's going to happen. Yes, if anybody's thinking, yes, I've also got that scene from The Sword in the Stone going through my head where where Merlin keeps changing Arthur into different things.
Right.
Yes, that is where Disney got the idea. But the later books, I've not read any of the books, but the later ones apparently are somewhat darker, becoming more serious with the adult themes relating, such as Lancelot, Guinevere, etc. One other thing though is that the series concludes just before Arthur's heading out to the fateful battle on Salisbury Plain.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one little thing in there, and you there's a connection to Mallory. As he's on his way over there, Arthur encounters a young Sir Thomas Mallory, who he charges with returning home and telling the story of the great experiment in Camelot.
Oh.
Camelot. Well, once the seven, I can't remember, but yes, which basically is the whole thing that becomes the musical Camelot, because at the end of Camelot, you see a lad called Tom. Just called him Tom in the film. I'm not sure in the play. Knights him and sends him back to tell everybody, and that is supposedly Thomas Mallory. In T.H. White's telling, that's Thomas Mallory. So it brings that round into a nice circle. So you've got that. Comes in. You've also got, of course, you've got other things on after that. You've got one of the series of books I did start reading. Well, a couple of books I started reading, never got into. Was Mary Stewart wrote the Crystal Cave trilogy, which are part of that Merlin, and there's a standalone book which is told from Mordred's point of view. Pardon me. Mary Stewart did her research. It's well written, regarded. She's well researched into both sub-Roman Britain and the realities of and the legend itself. Going back to Avalon again, another one I started to read and I've never managed to finish reading to my I wish I could. The Mists of Avalon, by Marion Zimmer Bradley, which is told from the point of view of Morgan Le Fay, and that's a very different telling. Most of the characters are feminine. It's a feminist retelling, but not really from the obnoxious feminism we seem to get these days. A lot of it it's also about the changing nature of the religion of Britain, between the old religion, what these days we would call paganism. I believe Bradley herself was a modern pagan, and Christianity coming in. And the myths of the title are you travel through them, and if you believe in the old ways, you arrive at Avalon.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhists. If you believe in the Christian ways, and the Christian ways are becoming more and more settled because England is becoming more and more Christian. If you're a Christian, you arrive at Glastonbury, and eventually the mist effectively closed, and the borders between the worlds close. But that there's about 6 or 7 books, because even after she wrote a few others, and after she died, there were prequels and sequels to that as well. There's also my personal favourite, the one that the one that I brought up from the at the end of my my introduction there. Again, if I can find it, is okay. I know why. Sorry, you can tell I'm not particularly professional at doing this, can't you?
Hey, you're doing a great job. You're coming with so much information. It's hard to find stuff in your notes too. At least you have the notes to refer back to.
I'm a professional something. I'm just not quite sure what. Yes, this one. Okay, so I realised I was slightly wrong. It's actually technically the end of this millennium, not the start of the next millennium, but the 1980s Camelot 3000. Yes, those are aliens there. It starts off with an alien invasion of Earth, and a young lad called Tom, if I'm right, interestingly. Young man, he's helping out on a dig at Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm.
Has to be Stonehenge, doesn't it? And he ducks into this tunnel from to hide from the invading aliens, and he literally smacks his car. This is comic. Literally smack into this fucking great stone sarcophagus, and it says, "Here lies Arthur." And yes, and it is, and his King Arthur comes out. He's all the other characters are incarnations, but literally it's King Arthur in space.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really good. It's actually really good. Some really, and the last actual, unfortunately, I couldn't. I didn't have the time I was going to actually go through. I've got it on PDF somewhere. The last actual picture in this, just to show the legend continues, is an alien, obviously utterly alien, not one of the bad guys, just a non-human alien. Literally, and he quite literally puts a tentacled arm around a sword in the stone and pulls it out.
Wow.
So the writers literally carry on there.
It's basically the legend can carry on in whatever form. I mean, it's a human and it's an alien, and who knows what other forms. That's a good thing with legends, is that it just seems that they have room to develop, and pardon the phrase, they take on a life of their own.
Yeah, I mean,
and a lot of times it gets the more time passes, the more exaggeration, the greater the feats.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of without treading on the territory of religions, I honestly don't know if there's a single character or story throughout certainly the Western canon, Western civilization, which can match King Arthur for its spread. I was watching a video the other day that someone was doing a comparison of which for those of us old enough to remember, will remember Monkey Magic.
Yeah. Colin, you broke up. It's a comparison of what?
Sorry, Journey to the West. It's a Chinese, an ancient Chinese classic, which has been filmed a number of times, most famously for those of a certain generation as Monkey, or Monkey Magic as it was known from the song. But that seems to have had a lot of films made of it. But I honestly don't. I mean, as I certainly internationally, you think of all the versions of King Arthur have been. I mean, I remember there was a TV series with Oliver Cotton, I think, called Arthur the Britons in the 70s, which again set King Arthur in the Anglo-Saxon, pre-Anglo-Saxon period. You've got obviously, I mean, on films, quite obviously, you've got probably the two most obvious ones are, of course, Monty Python and the Holy Grail,
Right.
and Excalibur.
Yeah.
Excalibur, which was very little to do with the any realities, but was a superb film anyway. You've got King Arthur, the movie with Clive Owen from what, the early 2000s. Keira Knightley, but I at least set that in the sub-Roman period. The Fisher King, a film I've never seen, but it's never appeared to me, but Robin Williams film, which takes as its inspiration the part of the story of the Grail, because the Fisher King is actually a figure from the Grail legend.
Mm-hmm.
In the legend, the Fisher King has been injured. It can never be healed until a certain question is asked. Percival is normally the one that normally sees it, and normally he's at a castle and he sees this progression, and this is where the first of the Grail is actually this is where it's a bowl. I know there's a profession. There's a procession, or so it's obviously a ritual procession, and he's supposed to ask a question and he doesn't, and he goes back eventually. And when he asks the question, which is who does the Grail serve, or what is the Grail and who does it serve, that's when the Fisher King is healed of his wound and can carry on. And that comes over. I believe that's partly there's a bit of studying PTSD and so on from the Robin Williams film. Again, I think perhaps the best description actually does come from, and I don't think it's just my boss as it being one of my favourite TV shows ever, from Babylon 5.
Right.
Because for anybody that's familiar with it, there is an episode in Babylon 5 where Michael York, of Logan's Run fame, amongst other things, comes onto the station. It's set in the 2200s, 2260s, I think. So 200 years in the future, 250 years in the future.
Right.
It was made in the 90s, but basically it's a big science fiction thing if you're not that familiar with it. But the basic story is this character comes on, he's wearing chain armor and he's carrying a sword. Now, how the hell he got hold of this, we never find out. But he comes up and he is Arthur, and he says he's Arthur, King of the Britons, and he acts like King Arthur. It will come as no surprise to anyone that because of the background stories, some of the things that happen in the background story of the universe, they give credence to the fact he might be, but almost immediately says, "Well, no, one of the characters, no, his speech patterns are all wrong, and this sort of thing there's no way." And it turns out he is actually a soldier suffering from effectively PTSD. But one of the characters is actually English, probably about the only English character. I think was certainly the only main character who's English in the show. And he comes from a colony. He's descended from Britain. And he makes a comment which is I think it probably sums it up best. I mean, he says, where I come from, his story still has great power. And I think that is...
Well, and that's a wonderful message right there, because we see it. I mean, there's the legend is universal. It can be translated into so many other stories. It's used to, even if it's not a direct medieval story, it's the themes of the Arthurian legends can be used in other shows. But it expands to entertainment, comedies. The Monty Python, the Holy Grail. There's a parody Spamalot. There's all kinds of different things, and that shows you that legends can actually be the basis of a lot of entertainment and even imagination.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, most legend and mythology, and I'm going to include from a wide and not intending to be offensive to anybody who is religious point of view, some aspects of religion can be mythic and legendary. They come from a time, a lot of it comes from a time before we wrote, before we had writing, before writing. They come from, you look at most of the Greek, a lot of the Greek myths. Wrote Troy, for example. If it happened, it probably happened sometime around the 13th century BC. 3,500 years ago from us. You get the Norse mythology. You get, as I said, Welsh. I mean, the Welsh, for example, still have a great tradition of oral storytelling. It comes in, so their stories they're told. They are the entertainment of their time. How much of them are ever intended to be taken seriously, and how many of them are, how much is always understood to be myth, to be story, to be this is giving examples, to be instructional is debatable. For almost any myth or legend, how much of it is anybody at any time ever actually thought was really true?
Yeah, but it can be like an example of behavior, an example of honor, an example of things of what good and bad should be.
Yeah,
it may not be real people, and events are not real, but they're published, and people look for a hero, especially in that time. Maybe when they started, they really looked for. I mean, it's not like we have so much media in our age now. We're actually overwhelmed with information, and back then, right? I mean, you were lucky if you could read, and the stories were handed down a lot of times, probably verbally, from generation to generation, and all you really had to use was your imagination. And also, people didn't have a car, TV, and everything else. It was a much harder life back then. And so these legends would give you hope for tomorrow, or, that there is good in the world, or good triumphs over evil. So, and then, of course, legends grow. It's like that game where you play in a circle where you're talking, where you start on one side, you tell one person something, and by the time it gets to the end and back to you, the story has changed, or it's grown into something much bigger than, it started with. But, it did give people, it was a vehicle to give people hope.
Yeah. Chinese was, start Chinese was to go, in one way. Exactly. But yeah, exactly. I mean, it's all from, it's myth. It's instructional for the specific purpose of instructing. If anybody's interested, this, which I'm putting in the chat now, hopefully, this is the name of the series of lectures that if anybody's interested in this, I cannot recommend these highly enough. As I say, we really aren't sponsored by the great courses, but they're fantastic. I can recommend them. But as I said, I mean, this particular, it's called King Arthur History and Legend. If anybody's interested in trying to track it down and find it, to find out more about these covers, this and so much more detail than I could in 3 hours. Never mind an hour and a half. We've been going.
Was there supposed to be a link in that, Colin?
No. It's literally just the name of it. It's not because I'm not sure where the link would be, and I wouldn't want to.
Okay, no, just checking.
Yeah, no,
just checking.
No, it's not. It's literally, it's just a name, but it's the Great Courses Plus. Although they've now changed their name, and I can't remember what they've changed it to. But
Oh boy.
it's something a lot less impressive than the Great Courses.
Yeah.
But it's a really, really fascinating. I say 24 half-hour lectures.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. I mean, the point again. I think the one thing that Babylon 5 quote points to is that the legend of King Arthur is so powerful and so potent that 250 years ahead of our time, so almost 2,000 years after the events which probably inspired him, it's so powerful that somebody suffering from PTSD because they effectively started a war can find comfort and can go back into that and can find comfort in that legend. You know, it's grown that much, as I say. When you think the just to go back, the first mention, he was worthy in the front of a most generous army. He gave out gifts from his herd steeds in the winter. He fed on ravens on the wall. Among the powerful in battle in the van of Shilwall, Gwathur, of a fortress. Though he was not Arthur, the first method we mentioned, that we have. One line, one word in one line. And that's just off camera, so to speak. From the original, and that's spun out to become what it is. I find that amazing. I mean, we've been going now for, as I said, an hour and a half? Yeah.
A lot of information, a lot of very good mythology, history, and all that out there. Just so much information.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, and that has literally just touched the tip of it, if you like, tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
Just the stories it's dragging on their own. You've got an entire corpus of mythology that comes from the Germanic and the French traditions. How it goes up. How it actually spreads into, for example, the Norse versions of it. You can see where the elements are, but it's so different. It's interesting if that's the way your mind goes. You're interested to go how it gets changed to fit the Norse mindset, the Germanic Teutonic mindset, the Spanish, whatever, wherever it goes, it changes, it absorbs, and it changes. It both gives and takes, because it gives ideas that can be adapted into a different culture, and it picks up their myths and adds them in.
Absolutely. There's just, like you said, it's just scratching the surface, and we really haven't spent a lot of time talking about all the side things, the musicals like Camelot, Spamalot, the parodies, the Monty Python movie. It's just, you got the Richard Gere, Sean Connery movie of it. Yep. We haven't even touched the entertainment, side out of it, because those stories change and are different in so many ways between each one.
Yeah.
And
how much of it is how much attention they. One of the things that this may surprise people if I admit this. I don't know. It's possible. This might come as a surprise to people, but I'm a little bit interested in history. Yeah, you might not notice this about me, but one of the things
I love history. That's why it's fascinating to listen to you, Colin.
but one of the things that that does at times really irritate me about historical movies is not when they're inaccurate. It's when they are trying to portray actual historical persons and events and they can't be bothered to do the research properly.
Yeah.
But with something like Art the Food, you can't really say that because they could be taking inspiration from anything in it.
Well, like you said, you can recast characters. You have some freedom with certain things like that, and you may not be able to show every single event in a historical things in an event because of time constraints, technology, things like that. But at least get the facts right.
Yeah.
Get the characters right. I mean, in terms of what their descriptions are, what their abilities and what their weaknesses too. Every human is a flawed character, but if you look at it and you make a character so perfect, it's like, where's your reality? Where's your connection with your research, your history? Or if you end up putting something in France that should have been in England, you could have changed the entire context of what you're trying to communicate.
I mean, you said Arthur's biggest weakness, probably the big was not so much hubris, was again something that a lot of people probably don't even realize that Excalibur came with a scabbard.
Mm-hmm.
And that when Arthur decides as a young man that he effectively decides war is more important than healing, is one way of putting it. And he chooses the sword rather than the scabbard, and the scabbard gets lost, as a result of which he can now be killed.
Right.
Which is why he ends up having to be dragged off to Avalon, etc. At the end, and so on. It goes back as well. I mean, I'm not sure if at what point it comes in when you get from if anybody remembers Excalibur, the beginning of Excalibur, where you get Uther gets the hots for the Duke of Cornwall's missus, and Merlin disguises him, and he goes and sleeps with her, and etc. And all that comes in. That's a medieval bringing. I think that was probably Geoffrey or maybe Malloy brings that in.
Mm-hmm.
They come in from all over the place, but I honestly don't know. I honestly can't think of anything that's probably has the reach and has dragged in so much as the Legends of King Arthur. Because it's, as I say, literally 1,500 years in the making and counting, and we haven't stopped making it yet.
Nope. And then, like you said, with Babylon 5, you can actually take it and put it into the future.
Well, Camelot 3000 takes it into the future.
Yeah, Camelot 3000, yeah.
Yeah, and so Babylon 5 takes in and actually shows its it doesn't actually feature King Arthur, but it shows the effect, the power, of the legend. It's just so much that it makes
exactly,
and that a character takes on the persona of Arthur as a defense mechanism.
Hey, on a light note though, Monty Python and the Holy Grail did take the Arthur legend into the future. You remember, because they all had the events back then, and all of a sudden at the end, at the castle attack, the police came up and arrested Arthur.
Yes, apparently they couldn't actually think of a way to end the film, so I read somewhere, but I'm going to watch that again at some point.
Oh,
Very
absolutely.
soon.
You know where I first watched that stupid movie? Or at least saw part of it. I was walking the hall my senior year in high school. I went to some other class where a friend of mine was in, and they were watching it near the end of this year.
Wow.
It's like, yeah, there's the American education system for you. But we were seniors. It was probably the last 2 weeks of I think finals were over, so they were just messing around. It's like you got to keep them up locked in for a certain number of days. But that's the first time I ever saw that movie.
Well, that sounds to me, a light note, an excellent way to bring this to an end.
All right.
Thank you for putting up with me, and thank you, folks in the chat. I hope you all found it interesting and informative.
Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and all the background. And there's a lot of information there. And thank you for doing the research and sharing your knowledge.
It's okay. You're welcome. The current plan at the moment, we're slightly in. No, I won't say we're in flux, because that might connect us to something else that's going on at the Sundays at the moment. I don't want to even think that. I don't want to even bother with. We're a little bit fluid. Our current plans, intent next week, hopefully, we are going to be pushing on with our retrospectives. We're going to be looking at the classic cult American TV shows from the 1970s. So I'm going to be largely in the hands of Don and hopefully Arwen, which is, and obviously for our American friends in the chat there, for what they remember from the cult shows of the 70s. So that's to look forward to. But in the meantime, I will leave you with our end titles. Thank you for watching and have a great week.
Thank you all.
You'll probably see most of you guys somewhere around the vastness of the internet sometime over the next few days.
Yes, thank you all for joining.
Good night.